Early in the morning of June 18, 1982, the body of a middle-aged man was found hanging from a noose beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge. He was identified as Roberto Calvi, the chairman of one of Italy's largest banks, which had just collapsed from a scandal that put it at the center of shadowy international power. Calvi's trousers had been stuffed with 12 pounds of bricks, and he was carrying nearly $20,000 in cash in his suit jacket pocket. He had just taken a sudden trip from Italy and had told people that he was worried for his life. The death at Blackfriars Bridge is still unsolved, and it was overflowing with Masonic symbolism. Freemasons refer to themselves as Black Friars due to the robes they wear. The bricks stuffed in Calvi's pockets served as pieces of literal masonry, and there is a Masonic oath stipulating that traitors should be roped down near rising water. It wasn't a coincidence. Calvi had, a year earlier, been identified as a high-ranking member of the deadliest and most powerful Masonic shadow government in history. Esoteric symbolism, strange hierarchies, a murky history, mysterious inner workings. These qualities have allowed the fraternal organizations collectively known as Freemasonry to capture the imagination of outsiders for centuries. Conspiracy theories about the Freemasons are a dime a dozen, and nearly all of them can be dismissed as urban legends. All of them, except for one. In the 1960s, an anonymous document entitled Our Political Action was sent to underground groups throughout Europe. It recommended the promotion of chaos in the developed world, leading to a situation of fear, political tension, and hostility toward the government and all political parties. It goes on to recommend working to highlight the shortcomings of the legally constituted government and to make us appear as the only ones capable of providing a social, political, and economic solution suited to the needs of the moment. Something oddly similar had been attempted in Italy in 1964. A Cold War nightmare was coming to pass. The Italian Communist Party had gained 25% of the vote. In response to this, the American Central Intelligence Agency and Italian Secret Service covertly recruited 4,000 agents to be trained in terrorism. Directed by Colonel Renzo Rocca, these agents were to pretend to be communists and commit acts of sabotage around the country, allowing a government of public safety to take control. The coup was called off at the final moment when a deal was struck in Italian parliament to keep the communists out of power, and news of the plot eventually became public. On June 27, 1968, Colonel Rocca was found dead inside his office in Rome from a gunshot to the temple, shortly before he was due to be questioned by a parliamentary commission about the planned terrorist attacks. His death was ruled a suicide, despite the fact that forensic tests found no traces on Rocca's hand that would suggest that he fired the pistol himself, and bloodstains indicated that he must have been lying flat on the floor when pulling the trigger. These strange details prompted General Carlo Ciglietti, the former head of the National Police, to commission his own investigation into the planned false flag attacks. On April 27, 1969, General Ciglietti was found dead in a mysterious car accident on a lonely dirt road at night. General Giorgio Manes, who worked with General Ciglietti on the investigation, dropped dead from a heart attack on the streets of Rome on June 25, 1969, the day he was set to give his report to the Parliamentary Commission. His assistant who wrote the report for him, Lieutenant Remo D'Ottavio, shot himself in the heart a month later. These unexplained deaths marked the beginning of a period in Italian history known as the Years of Lead that would stretch into the 1980s. The era was characterized by widespread turmoil, with over 400 people being killed in terrorist attacks and urban warfare. Something very strange was going on, stranger than anyone could have imagined. A secret society was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. A Masonic shadow government called Propaganda Due, or P2, whose reach extended far beyond Italy's borders.
Good evening. Italy was in search of a new government today for the 41st time since the end of World War II. Government number 40, headed by Prime Minister Arnaldo Forlani, collapsed yesterday under the weight of a most unusual scandal, the revelation that nearly 1,000 of Italy's elite including 3 cabinet members, were allegedly members of an outlawed, super-secret, super-evil Masonic lodge called P2.
There's a wide spectrum of conflicting views as to the true nature of P2. Some maintain that it was primarily a society of white-collar criminals looking to make powerful connections, and others contend that it was an underground political organization. There's also disagreement over its purposes, whom it served, and whom it targeted. I've read 4 books and dozens of articles on P2, and I've done my best to verify, compare, and weigh their claims for this video, but even some of the hard facts are contradictory, and there's a shocking lack of information about the organization online. What is known is that this mysterious Masonic cult existed at the intersection of the pillars of international power, and every conspiracy of the era seems to have flowed into one. To begin to understand this story, we must understand the murky biography of an Italian businessman named Licio Gelli. Gelli had been a fascist military officer in Italy during World War II, but more than a fascist, Licio Gelli was always on the winning side. Predicting an Allied victory at the closing stages of the war, Gelli became a trusted agent of the communist resistance in Italy. He led German troops on wild goose chases through the countryside so that the communists could outmaneuver them. At the same time, he was working with American intelligence and helped them smuggle Nazis out of Europe and into South America, where they could avoid justice. Gelli became rich by smuggling 1,600 Nazis in this way. One was Klaus Barbie, a notorious Nazi war criminal known as the Butcher of Lyon, who was recruited by American intelligence after the war. Gelli himself was recruited by Italian intelligence in 1956. He would act as the liaison between the CIA and the Italian Secret Service during their aborted terrorist plots of 1964. By 1963, Gelli had already been inducted into Freemasonry by Giordano Gambarini, the Grand Master of all Masonic lodges in Italy. Gambarini would task Gelli with leading and reorganizing a dormant Masonic lodge called Propaganda 2, Italian for Propaganda 2. Gambarini was explicit in his goals. He wanted to gather the most powerful men possible into a group that would be useful for expanding the influence of Freemasonry. By 1969, P2 was being spoken of as an important Masonic lodge among the Italian elite. Gelli had a genius for convincing others that he had immense influence, and many joined P2 because they believed that his patronage could advance their careers. By expanding the lodge's membership in this way, his influence became quite real. Others were pushed into P2 by blackmail. Gelli demanded and received secrets, official secrets which he could use to extend his power, and personal secrets he could use to blackmail others into joining his lodge. When a new member joined P2, that initiate was obliged to demonstrate loyalty by handing over to Gelli documents that would compromise not only the new member himself, but other possible targets. Confronted with evidence of their own wrongdoings, these new targets joined P2. Membership thus spread like a virus. P2 members would meet at the Excelsior Hotel in Rome, directly across the street from the United States Embassy. Licio Gelli would hold court from his mahogany desk 3 days a week in a 3-room suite. The suite had 2 doors that acted as a separate entrance and exit respectively, so arriving P2 members could not encounter those who were leaving. No one person knew the entire membership of the lodge, except for Licio Gelli. This was a cult, not a social club. As part of the occult initiation rituals, members donned black robes with sinister-looking black pointed hoods that covered their faces, and agreed to have their throats slit and tongues cut out if they broke the oaths they made to the secret society. On December 7, 1970, the lodge attempted to execute a plan to topple the Italian government. The coup attempt involved hundreds of members of the Italian armed forces, all of whom were members of P2. The planners intended to seize the defense ministry and kidnap the Italian president. But the plans were canceled at the last minute, because the government had been tipped off and was prepared to declare martial law. This showed the power of P2. They had the ability to implement and call off military coups, and this impressed even the American CIA, which was allied to P2 throughout the Lodge's existence. The official leaders of Italian Freemasonry were becoming worried. At the meeting of the Governing Council on July 10, 1971, Grand Master Lino Salvini, who was Gelli's nominal boss, warned his colleagues that P2's infiltration of Masonic circles and its plans to take over Italy were out of control. Salvini planned to strip Gelli of his position and dissolve P2. Gelli learned of this and notified Salvini that if he were to act against P2, Gelli would have the Grand Master arrested within 30 minutes. Salvini realized he wasn't in charge and accepted his position as another one of P2's pawns. The Grand Master even elevated Gelli to the Masonic rank of Worshipful Master in a letter written in an affectionate tone. Dearest Licio, I'm extremely pleased to raise you to the degree of Worshipful Master. I see that you have understood the importance of this function, and I am convinced that you will carry out your constitutional tasks with the enthusiasm that you always have. My wish is that this function, up to now performed by the great masters, will give you the satisfactions you desire. I hug you, Lino Salvini. In 1976, Licio Gelli drafted what he called the Plan for Democratic Revival. The document laid out a scheme for creating a shadow government by placing P2 members in key positions at all levels of power throughout Italian society, with the ultimate goal of replacing Italy's legal government and constitution with one of a presidential dictatorship, where the cult's power would be law. According to plan, elites from every dimension of power would become members of the secret society. 30 generals, 213 other senior military officers, 43 members of parliament, 4 cabinet ministers including the Minister of Justice, a member of Italy's Supreme Court, 36 judges, former, current, and future prime ministers, all 3 chiefs of Italy's spy agencies, newspaper editors, TV executives, businessmen, bankers, professors, leaders of the mafia, members of the police, and high-ranking Catholic bishops, even though Catholics were forbidden from being Freemasons. Silvio Berlusconi, a billionaire who would become Italy's prime minister in the 1990s, was a P2 member. So was Giulio Andreotti, who served as the prime minister of Italy 3 times from the 1970s to the 1980s and is regarded as the most powerful politician in the history of the Italian Republic. The cabal unified political forces that were otherwise opposed. Italy's major parties all had sitting members of parliament who were also members of the Lodge. P2 had become a fully fledged shadow government. In accordance with its strategy of destabilization, P2 was involved in nearly every major tragedy and attack that plagued Italy during its reign, including the 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing, which killed 17 people. The investigation of the massacre was later found to have been obstructed by the head of Italian counterintelligence, who was also a P2 member. The 1978 kidnapping and assassination of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro. His kidnappers were the far-left Red Brigades, who served as unwitting puppets of P2. The 1979 murder of Mino Pecorelli, a journalist and rogue P2 member. He had written about connections between P2, the CIA, and Prime Minister Moro's assassination. Pecorelli was shot dead as he got into his car in the street below his office. Police found a stone placed in his mouth, an occult gesture meant to announce that he would never divulge a secret again. The 1980 Bologna massacre, which killed 85 people, the deadliest terrorist attack in Italian history. The head of Italy's military intelligence service, who was a P2 member, was later convicted of creating misdirections to lead the investigation of the massacre away from P2. In 2020, prosecutors concluded that the late Licio Gelli was among those who had ordered the attack. By the late 1970s, P2 had gone global. It had branches in the United States, France, the United Kingdom, West Germany, Portugal, Argentina, Uruguay, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. The secret society had gone above and beyond its master plan to infiltrate every institution of power in Italy. P2 had infiltrated the power bases of the Western world. Juan Perón was the most important political figure in the history of Argentina. He was elected 3 times as president and founded the Peronism political movement that dominates the country to this day. He was also a puppet of P2. Perón was introduced to Licio Gelli while the Argentine leader was exiled in Spain in early 1971. Gelli was subsequently a guest of honor at Perón's inauguration for his 3rd presidential term in 1973, after his return from exile. After the inauguration, Perón knelt at the feet of Licio Gelli. Italy's prime minister and P2 member, Giulio Andreotti, also attended the inauguration, but even the leader of Italy failed to receive the same gesture of respect from the Argentine president. Juan Perón died in 1974, and the presidency passed to his wife and vice president, Isabel Perón. But the real power behind the throne was José López Rega, Isabel's Minister of Social Security, who exercised Rasputin-like control over her. Widely known as the Warlock, Rega was a P2 member and an esotericist who wrote several books on the occult and had an entire library full of grimoires from throughout history. He believed that he was the physical incarnation of the Archangel Gabriel and claimed that he possessed magical powers. At the very least, Isabel was completely under his spell. At the Warlock's urging, Isabel would lie inside the coffin of Juan Perón's first wife, Eva, in an attempt to absorb some of the dead woman's power. The Warlock was the de facto ruler of Argentina during both of the Perón's regimes, placing the country under the covert domination of P2, much like Italy. Documents found years later show that P2 gave policy orders to the Warlock, who then passed them on to the Peróns for implementation, and that he handpicked every government minister. The Warlock was also the secret leader of AAA, the P2-aligned paramilitary terrorist organization responsible for the death and disappearance of 1,100 people considered to be their enemies. But for all his magic, the Warlock and his puppet were deposed in a coup in 1976 and a military junta seized power. A leader of the junta, Admiral Emilio Massera, was yet another member of P2. In the darkest moments in Argentina's history, Massera helped orchestrate the junta's dirty war, a state terrorism campaign that resulted in the death and disappearance of up to 30,000 people. In 1987, the tomb of Juan Perón was broken into by agents of P2. In an occult ritual, Perón's body was desecrated and his hands were severed and stolen, along with his sword. The ritualistic nature of the theft made it clear that the hands held occult significance to the thieves. They are theorized to have served as the Hand of the Mysteries, also known as the Hand of the Master Mason, an alchemical amulet that represents the transformation of man into God. P2's web of subterranean influence extended deep inside the United States. Licio Gelli himself attended the inaugural ceremonies of Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan. The worshipful master was invited to Reagan's exclusive inaugural ball in 1981, where he was seated only one table away from the president. Gelli attested that he was a friend of George H.W. Bush, who was vice president under Reagan and would go on to become president himself. In 1990, Gelli was quoted as saying, "I'm a friend of the current president, George Bush. I met him in 1981 at Reagan's inauguration. We saw one another for an entire week." But what would two supposed strangers have to talk about for an entire week? There's evidence that Jelly was lying, that the worshipful master had visited Bush well before the inauguration, and even made the future president an honorary P2 member in 1976 when Bush was director of the CIA. Their friendship was a dark one. On the eve of the 1980 presidential election, President Jimmy Carter was in trouble. 52 American hostages were held in Iran by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and this was an enormous factor in the Carter administration's unpopularity. Bringing the hostages home would be a decisive boost for Carter's race against Ronald Reagan and his running mate George H.W. Bush. P2 ensured that didn't happen. Top P2 members, including Licho Jelly, secretly met with Iranian officials in Switzerland to make a deal to delay the release of the hostages until after Reagan's election. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, the day that Ronald Reagan took office. The Reagan administration subsequently rewarded Iran with clandestine weapon shipments that were later revealed in the Iran-Contra affair. A second 1980 election operation was masterminded by P2. President Carter's brother, Billy, had found himself amidst controversy after accepting a loan from the government of Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi in 1979. The scandal had died down by the time of the 1980 race, but P2 member and Italian Secret Service head Francesco Pazienza, who helped cover up P2's involvement in the Bologna massacre that same year, made sure the Billygate controversy came back to life. Working with American journalist Michael Ledeen, less than 2 weeks before Election Day, Pazienza planted a story claiming that Billy Carter had taken yet another loan from Gaddafi, and that Billy had a secret meeting with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. Neither of these accusations were ever corroborated. An Italian court subsequently convicted Pazienza of masterminding the Billygate scandal. Ledeen was not charged, but the verdict specifically named him. Pazienza testified that the journalist accepted $120,000 from Italian military intelligence for his work on the Billygate project. On September 25, 1986, Jelly sent a telegram to P2 member Philip Guarino, who was an American political operative in close contact with Vice President George H.W. Bush. The telegram said, "Please tell our friend Bush that the Swedish palm will be brought down." 3 days later, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was assassinated. Palme was a socialist who supported national liberation movements, and he was one of the fiercest opponents of U.S. foreign policy in the Western world. Palme's assassination is unsolved to this day. In 2020, the Swedish government officially closed the investigation, saying that no suspect had enough evidence against them to ever be brought to trial. Michele Sindona was born as an Italian peasant in 1920, but by the time he was initiated into P2 in 1964, he was already running a banking empire that managed the Sicilian mafia's money. By 1969, Sindona's holding company came to possess 6 banks and hundreds of other businesses, making him a billionaire in today's dollars. That year, with the help of P2-affiliated bishops, he was brought in to manage the Catholic Church's sprawling investments. This was an opportunity for Sindona. Because of Vatican City's status as a sovereign state under the control of the Church, the Vatican Bank is not subject to oversight or regulation by anyone but Church authorities, making it the most secret bank on Earth. It can move massive amounts of money around the world very quietly. By 1971, there were more than 500,000 heroin addicts in the United States, all of whom ultimately bought from mafia-controlled refinement operations in Italy, operations that were protected from law enforcement by P2's control of the country. This addiction crisis produced billions of dollars for P2 and its allies, funding the cult's shadowy operations. Huge amounts of dirty money moved from Sindona's banks through the Vatican to Swiss banks. But in 1974, it would all come tumbling down. A sudden stock market crash destroyed Sindona's New York-based Franklin National Bank, resulting in what was at the time the largest bank failure in U.S. history and triggering a chain reaction that would bring down Sindona's banking empire over the next few years. The Vatican Bank, a silent partner in many of Sindona's business schemes, took a financial beating of over $100 million. Sindona was sentenced to life in prison in 1984 for orchestrating the death of the investigator charged with liquidating his Italian bank holdings. In 1986, Sindona died after drinking coffee laced with cyanide. A guard at the prison had heard Sindona say, "They have poisoned me," just before passing out and dying. Days before his death, Sindona was quoted as saying, "They are afraid that I could reveal some very delicate information that they don't want divulged." But another Vatican financial scandal was brewing, and it was far larger than the collapse of Franklin National. It centered around a man named Roberto Calvi. Calvi got his start as the protege of Sindona, who sponsored Calvi's initiation into P2. Calvi eventually worked his way up to become the general manager of Banco Ambrosiano in 1971. Ambrosiano was one of Italy's largest banks, and it was founded as an explicitly Catholic institution, and as such had close ties to the Vatican Bank, which was one of Ambrosiano's largest shareholders. Calvi, like most P2 members, had ambitions. He used his complex network of overseas ghost companies that he personally controlled to borrow money from Banco Ambrosiano. These companies would then transfer the borrowed money back to Calvi's pockets in Italy so that he could buy shares for himself and Ambrosiano and then inflate the share price of the bank. The plan, however, relied on a stable exchange rate between the US dollar and the Italian lira. A suddenly unfavorable exchange rate led to huge losses, which were plugged up with even more loans in a vicious cycle. Further expenses came from the fact that much of the bank's money was simply used to fund P2 projects, such as buying up newspapers and forcing them to print news that served the cult's agenda, and giving an illegal $200 million loan to the P2 allied Argentine dictatorship to pay for high-tech weapons. In 1978, the Bank of Italy produced a report on Ambrosiano that predicted disaster and led to criminal investigations. Soon afterward, the investigating magistrate was killed by a left-wing terrorist group that was under the manipulations of P2. Shortly after that, the Bank of Italy official who supervised the investigation found himself imprisoned and suspended from his duties on charges that were later found to be absolutely groundless. But more prying eyes were set on Calvi and his bank. Pope John Paul I was elected to lead the Catholic Church on August 26, 1978. Prompted by Sindona's recent financial chaos, the Pope was on the verge of launching an investigation into the Vatican Bank. But before the investigation could start, a healthy 65-year-old John Paul I dropped dead after only 33 days in office. The official story is that the Pope had a heart attack, but there are credible suspicions that something darker took place. His body was drained and embalmed immediately upon being discovered, in violation of both Vatican protocol and Italian law, prompting speculation that officials wanted to hide evidence of poisoning in the blood. The Vatican also changed its story at least once. It first announced that the Pope's secretary had found the body, before later admitting that it was in fact a nun who had come in to serve the Pope's morning coffee. 12 days after John Paul I's death, John Paul II was elected to the throne of St. Peter. For all his virtues, the new Pope took little interest in the Vatican Bank's operations. But despite all machinations, the Italian government could not be stopped from investigating Ambrosiano, and began following the breadcrumbs back to P2 and Licio Gelli. On March 17, 1981, police raided the Arezzo, Italy home of Gelli and found his list of 962 members of P2, including Roberto Calvi. On March 20th, Calvi was arrested and sent to prison. When questioned by investigators, Calvi broke into tears. "I am just the lowest of the low. I'm a dog who serves others," he sobbed. The investigators asked, "Then who commands you? Who is the controller of the bank?" Calvi replied, "I can't tell you anymore." Calvi was soon freed on bail. By June 1982, it had become known that $1.4 billion had been embezzled through Calvi's ghost companies. Ambrosiano had collapsed, and P2 wanted its money. Calvi was scared and had been making frequent trips abroad to throw off anyone who might have been following him. On June 17th, Ambrosiano's board voted to fire Calvi and dissolve the bank. That same day, Calvi's secretary fell from the 5th floor of the bank's headquarters. The cause of death remains unknown, and no arrests were made. A day later, Calvi was found dead, hanging below Blackfriars Bridge in London. Calvi's death was initially ruled a suicide by British police. It took nearly 20 years to determine that the banker had been murdered, but no murderer was ever convicted. The P2 Commission was set up by the Italian Parliament to investigate the Masonic cult in 1981, revealing to the public a dizzying web of power. It was the greatest scandal in the history of the Republic, and the Prime Minister and his P2 infiltrated cabinet were forced to resign. Parliament quickly passed a law banning secret societies and dissolving P2. Within a few years, dozens of P2 members were convicted. The shadow government was officially gone. But every attempt to put Licio Gelli behind bars for a litany of P2-related crimes was mysteriously frustrated, and he never served time in prison. Gelli was placed under house arrest in 2001. He died of natural causes in 2015, at the age of 96. It might be premature to consign P2's mystery to the past. In a wiretapped conversation revealed in 2013, Mafia boss Pantaleone Mancuso said, "The Mafia is no more. The Freemasons remain." He was referring to La Santa, an elite and clandestine Masonic sect within the Mafia that has continued P2's pattern of secret societies within secret societies. Membership in the Santa is only known to other members, and these members take leading roles in Masonic lodges around the world. These lodges are full of judges, politicians, and police officers, and act as secret nexuses of influence with the powers of the state. In November 2021, millions of dollars worth of cocaine stamped with Masonic square and compass symbols was seized in a massive drug bust in Italy. These and other Masonic symbols have repeatedly shown up in packets seized from drug smugglers. Something failed to die with P2 and Licio Gelli. It's been suggested by sources closest to the P2 scandal that the secret society's chain of command went above Licio Gelli. Clara Calvi, the widow of Roberto Calvi, said that the real head of P2 was not Gelli, echoing the mysterious statements made by her husband himself while imprisoned, that he was just an errand boy for much greater powers. One investigator from the P2 Commission said that Licio Gelli was a man of modest intelligence, suggesting that he could not have been the mastermind of such a shadow government. A greater mystery was at work. The Commission's final report in 1984 went on to state something terrifying. It proclaimed that P2 was a pyramid with Gelli at the apex, but joined to the top of this pyramid was another, higher, inverted pyramid, containing the forces responsible for overall strategy. These mysterious figures passed their instructions down to the lower pyramid through Gelli, whose sole function was to follow orders. The Commission could only confirm the existence of this even more secret conspiracy above P2 that was pulling the strings from even deeper shadows, but it could not determine what it was or identify its members. The Commission simply stated, "We do not know who they are." Anyone falling down this rabbit hole must ask themselves what's more important, knowing the truth or keeping your sanity.